So what are the common causes of meltdowns in children with autism? Well, various triggers, and we know based on the diagnosis of autism, these kids have sensory sensitivities, have difficulty with rigidity and routine. You are going to find you have to look at some of these areas as whether there's been a noise that's bothering them, for example, the vacuum cleaner, for example, or I had a child who was covering his ears and running around the playground suddenly because he was hearing the sound of an aeroplane flying in the sky before the parents could actually see it. So sometimes you don't quite know what the trigger is, and it's a matter of being a detective. But if you know your child has sensory issues or auditory issues, be prepared when you go out to malls and noisy places, and because that can definitely be a trigger for a meltdown. A lot of these children have sensory regulation issues. So when overloaded by activity and sound, or if they're tired or hungry and sleepy, they're more likely to have meltdowns. So what they could tolerate otherwise, they're less likely to tolerate. Frustration, not being able to communicate your needs and not having the language can cause a meltdown. Well, common meltdowns can also be because you're not getting what you want, and that's okay. That's when limits need to be set and kids can be transitioned and prepared, and those meltdowns need to be handled. But if it's a meltdown for a reason you don't understand, you need to be a bit of a detective to try and figure it out. And knowing your child, what their issue is, what is their particular concern, for example, whether it's clothing, for example, the label at the back of a shirt. Some kids, for example, have gluten sensitivity, and having had gluten or dairy added to their diet in a hidden formula, for example, parents have reported back to me that, my goodness, I noticed a change in behavior, or the child became more upset more easily and had more tantrums and meltdowns. So going backwards, but also dealing with it in the moment so that the child does not hurt themselves or hurt anybody else with their meltdown. But going back and really investigating or finding out what your child needs to prevent the triggers, what stimulates this upset behavior is very important. So what are some of the common behaviors seen in children with an autism spectrum disorder? I'm going to start out with the core deficits because children often present or commonly present with speech delay or with atypical speech development. Echolalia, for example, repeating words out of context, not having the back and forth with language or the verbal volley of communication. Also, one of the commonly seen things is this lack of eye contact or gaze monitoring, which is so important in our social communication with each other, looking into each other's eyes, picking up from that, a lot of nonverbal communication. And the other thing that is typically seen is this stereotypic behavior. Repetitive behaviors, hand flapping, spinning, sometimes head banging, or what they call a deviant eye gaze, staring at something from the side of your eye or tracking a line along the wall, for example. These, together with difficulty with change in routine. Kids tend to be very rigid or have difficulty with transitioning and change, and have meltdowns when there's a change in that. In fact, they often want to keep things exactly the same, and that's how their play is. They want to put their toys in a particular way and actually do not want somebody else to touch their toys. Unlike somebody wanting, hey, my parent, come and play with me. So some of these behaviors that you're seeing or that parents come in describing as unusual is seen in children with the autism spectrum. And this goes with the core deficits that these children have, which include sensory issues, for example. Some kids are very sensitive to clothing and really like to take all their clothes off and lie on the ground, for example, or like the texture of a certain fabric, or the coolness of tiles, or rubbing their cheek against a certain fabric, or smelling things. They like to smell things, or mouth objects. There's so many different symptoms that, looking at the absence of one, don't just say, hey, my child doesn't do all of this, but does something else. It is a variation of stereotypic behaviors, speech and language, whether that's echolalia or scripting, for example. And behavior has often a purpose. It can be in response to something or seeking something, or because they're wanting comfort from that. And a lot of repetitive behaviors can be doing that. A lot of stimming or rocking behaviors that you see. Some of the behaviors are seen in play. For example, children can either just line up toys like blocks and Legos and crayons and shoes, any object, but it has to be in a certain order, or they have a particular fascination for one particular toy. Everything is trains, or everything is the solar system, or dinosaurs, for example. And they tend to engage more in solitary play. They're not interested in getting other children to actually come close to them. In fact, it bothers them. Or they may come too close to another child, for example, and have difficulty with boundaries, and have difficulty with the self-regulation. There are many different behaviors that we see in children with the autism spectrum. We need to understand the behaviors, whether it's communicating something to us, and actually all behavior is communicative. And you need to understand the core symptoms, deal with the causes, and deal with what your particular child needs to make that behavior more functional and communicative, so he can engage or she can engage with children and with you. So just to mention a few of the tips to live with a child with an autism spectrum disorder. There are many things you can do, and you really, again, have to tailor it to your particular child and the age of the child. For example, a younger toddler who has no sense of danger, you have to make the environment safer. If you're finding the child is very sensitive to certain sounds, like a simple hairdryer or vacuum cleaner, and that really dysregulates and upsets your child, I would be careful with that. The more you can prepare and adjust the environment for your child, easier your life is going to be. A lot of children with the autism spectrum issues really do well with structure and routine and predictability, because that makes them feel safe. And they have difficulty with transitioning, so the more you can create of that in your home environment, it's going to be easier. Since we know these children have speech and language issues, and communication is a problem, finding tools that will help your child communicate is very important. Often using visual cues, particularly for a child who is very language delayed or maybe even nonverbal, using the picture system or having social stories where you can prepare the child ahead of time is very important. Keeping a particular space that is safe for the child, where they can go and self-regulate. Some children really get overstimulated and get calmed down by massage or by brushing, for example. Or some children need the exercise and they can jump on a trampoline and that calms them down afterwards. So based on your particular child, you will create little accommodations in your living environment. The more you can plan, the more you can predict, the less tantrums you will have and the less meltdowns. Another area that I would definitely focus on is look at food. Look if your child has any food allergies or food intolerances, and that can be a trigger for a child's distress or behavioral outbursts. So these are little tips that you need to be aware of, and be vigilant about different environments that a child is going into. Be prepared for that. If a child has auditory sensitivity issues and they're going out to a noisy mall, or and they will let you know that distresses them, and you will live through it once to get prepared, and you will develop your tip. But do mention it, and also speak to parents. I find parent support groups and blogs very helpful for other tips, because parents can teach each other and help each other with ideas as to what worked with their particular child. And you become the little professor actually for your own child. There are many tips and strategies you can get from books, from other parents, but you will have to tailor it for your child and his or her needs. There are many early signs of autism, and parents actually sometimes have a gut on it. But things that we know about are eye contact, not monitoring the back and forth that a child would otherwise do, and that is picked up very early. Babbling behavior and cooing sounds, which are very early, can also be repetitive. I've had children sometimes not having difficulty with motor imitation, and that's one of the things that is talked about in the literature. I've had children be repetitive even with a play. A child has been fascinated with the rattle and repetitively play with that. You can have a child with sensory sensitivity, wanting to be held too much and not wanting to be held, having a preference for constantly wanting to be rocked, for example. These are little concerns, and parents can pick up on or have a gut on these things sometimes, and they minimize it. So I think it's important to look at language, communication, and it could be verbal, non-verbal, with social referencing, following, laughing. The verbal volley is very important. And this gaze monitoring, which you see a little child do. They monitor their mother's eyes. There's a back and forth. There's the alertness and interest in the other that seems to be missing or not adequately developed. Not responding to their name when they're called. Most kids should do that by 8 to 9 months of age. And when you find that happening, it is of concern. And that is one of the earlier signs that needs to be addressed and mentioned to your pediatrician. One of the early signs that is commonly seen and is of concern is this lack of joint attention, which means we're both looking at something together. When you point towards something, a child will point towards something and look at you for you to understand. So there's that communication piece that seems to be missing. Children are often just reaching out for what they want, and that's the way they communicate, or they don't point with their index finger. There's sometimes just lots of crying and no verbal communication. So these are concerns that you have. The social referencing or that lack of connection is something that parents pick up on, and I think is definitely one of the early signs that needs to be concerned about. Applied behavior analysis is one of the common behavioral interventions that is recommended for children diagnosed with the autism spectrum. ABA is the common lingo, and that's what you hear more often, and that's what it stands for. There are versions of ABA, and the one developed or commonly used is called discrete trial. It was developed by Dr. Lovas from UCLA, and what is interesting is it is based on the theory of rewarding certain behaviors, and that is what was done by little trials. You can retrain a child. For example, if you wanted adequate eye contact or tapping on the table, and you had the child, you asked them to do so, and you reinforced them every time positively for when they were able to do so by giving either a raisin or something they like to eat, or preferably something they like to do, because I think food is another issue. But traditionally there have been food items that have been used to reinforce behavior. This can be done consistently with supporting them or giving a no when it's the negative behavior. One of the modifications that has taken place is that everything gets a positive, and if you're not getting the kind of response you want, you use prompting. So there's success with every attempt, and that takes some of the negative out of it. Variations have been done of the ABA, and there's also now a program called Applied Verbal Analysis, where they use a lot more language than just behavior, and this is getting more popular because it encourages children to you see the benefit of using language to get their needs met. ABA, as I'm going to use that term, is provided by a lot of the programs through early intervention, also in special preschools, and can be provided both in school as well as at home. Early intervention programs often apply the ABA at home. The study that was done by Dr. Lovas was actually 40 hours of ABA. Now, probably that was used for higher functioning kids. There's some mixed responses to his data, but a lot of those kids actually got normalized with some of their behaviors, and that is exciting. A lot of ABA programs now are covered between 20 to 30 hours. Parents get the best they can through the school system or through early intervention, otherwise go privately and avail of it.